Okay, so the meeting is now in public session, and it is being broadcast online and throughout Parliament building, so I just welcome anyone watching online. So if we can mute our mobile phones, and just to say, if anybody joins the gallery, there should be no recording. So I would like to formally welcome Timothy Gaston to the committee. You're very welcome, and to thank Padraig Delargy, who has left, been replaced by him, and to thank him for his contributions to the committee. So we have two witness sessions today, and they will be recorded by Hansard. So if committee members are content, we will proceed with the agenda. Okay, so I don't think we have any apologies. Have we any declarations of interest to declare? No? Okay.
Chair, under apologies, I need to leave at 4:45, long-standing commitment I have back in the constituency office, so just want to put that in.
Well, I think there's quite a number of people who are going to have to leave, so if we keep all our questions very succinct today, we can get through this and we can maximise our contribution from the witnesses. Okay, so just quickly with Chairperson's business. So Connie Egan is Deputy Chair, and I met with the First Deputy First Minister earlier this week, just before the announcement or the ministerial statement on the programme for government, and I know we all received a copy in our pigeonholes. We will be, as a committee, coordinating the responses on this, and we will be writing to all of the committees in that regard. So are we content that we go ahead and issue those letters to the other committees? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the First and Deputy First Minister and Junior Ministers are scheduled to come to committee on the 2nd of October to give us an opportunity to ask questions on the programme for government and their whole programme of work. We've also asked at the tail end of that session if departmental officials can come to talk about the recall motion in the summer in terms of their actions in that space. So there will be an opportunity for us to cover a lot of ground in that. So I would also ask your agreement around inviting officials to come at the end of the consultation process, probably around the 6th of November, to talk about the programme for government, the consultation process and how it was put together. Content? Okay. Okay, so draft minutes, members, are found on pages 7 to 10 of your pack. Are members content with these minutes and content that I'll go ahead and sign them? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. No matters arising, so we'll get straight into today's business. So, members, we are, as you know, having an inquiry into gaps in equality legislation, and our first session is with the Equality Commission. So if you'd like to come forward, the clerk's brief is found on page 13 of the pack. Page 15 of the pack, there's a briefing. That's the Equality Commission. Page 17, there's the RAISE briefing paper, and that was quite an intensive piece. Just to let you know, members, we are going to try to get somebody from RAISE to come on the 25th of September to talk us through that, because there was quite a lot there. So just to let you know that was coming. There's also a pack on summary of international human rights standards. Okay, so welcome to the meeting. So we have Geraldine McGahey, who is the Chief Commissioner for the Equality Commission, with Roisin Mallon, Director of the Dedicated Mechanism Unit, the Equality Commission, and Catherine Barr, who is the Senior Policy Officer, Strategic Policy and Strategic Engagement, also at the Equality Commission. So thank you for your submission, and we just invite you to make some opening remarks. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to attend today. But at the outset, could I just put on record that we really welcome this inquiry, and we are hopeful that it will help put equality law reform firmly back onto the political agenda, which will be to the benefit of everyone in Northern Ireland. We think it's an important piece of work. Equality law reform has not been a priority for the Executive and the Assembly for many years. We have seen the Assembly vote through only one piece of equality law protection since its establishment, and that was on foot of a private member's bill. While other jurisdictions have moved forward in terms of equality protections, Northern Ireland has effectively stood still and is falling behind international standards. Just last month, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in its concluding observations on the UK, highlighted the need for comprehensive anti-discrimination and equality legislation, particularly here in Northern Ireland. The Commission is thoroughly invested in improving our legislative framework for the benefit of everyone living here. We have a statutory duty to keep equality legislation under review, and over the years we have built up a bank of recommendations on law reform, including identification of significant gaps in our equality laws. Northern Ireland currently has a patchwork of equality legislation. The inconsistent protections across equality law in Northern Ireland add to complexity and cost, all negatively impacting on individuals, employers, service providers, and those indeed providing advice. In the simplest of terms, it means that people living here are unable to challenge some types of discrimination because the laws simply do not exist to protect them. The effect is that people in Northern Ireland who experience discrimination, including some of the most vulnerable or marginalised in our society, have less protection against discrimination, harassment and victimisation across a number of equality grounds compared to their counterparts in Great Britain and in Ireland. Whilst we have a series of long-standing recommendations across a number of areas of equality law reform, ideally we would favour working towards a single equality bill because it would allow us to improve and move all of our discrimination laws forward at the one time. However, and I stress, incremental change is better than no change at all. I'm sure we will discuss our broader recommendations and calls across the equality grounds, but for now I would like to concentrate on and highlight a number of key areas of anti-discrimination legislation which urgently require action. We now live in a very diverse society, more so than ever before. We welcome people from around the world who have chosen to come here to work and to live, but I think the horrendous events and racist attacks over the summer months serve as a sobering reminder that racism is alive and well in our society. Our ethnic minority communities need to have adequate protections in place. For over a decade, the Commission has been calling for reform of race equality legislation, and we welcome that there has been some movement in recent times. It's imperative that this work gains momentum, and as the body with a statutory remit in this area, we would welcome sight of the draft legislation as a matter of urgency. We look forward to seeing the delivery of reformed race equality law and aspects of hate crime law within the current mandate. Turning to the protections on the basis of age, in Northern Ireland there is still no protection against age discrimination in relation to the provision of goods, facilities and services, despite considerable work having been done in this area during the last mandate whenever it was previously in the programme for government. I stress this is the only jurisdiction in these islands without any form of protection in this area. So those who believe they have been discriminated against because of their age when accessing, say, healthcare or financial services have no recourse to legal challenge. We need to see legislation to protect people of all ages against discrimination. Disabled people too require stronger protections under the law in all aspects of their life. Currently, there are varying protections against disability discrimination in Northern Ireland, which are actually inconsistent and confusing. There are significant gaps with no protection from indirect discrimination or discrimination arising from disability. Many of the complexities and indeed the gaps in the law that remain here were actually addressed in GB with the Equality Act of 2010. So by harmonising and simplifying the disability legislation, it would make it much easier for disabled people, first of all, to understand what their rights are and know when they can challenge less favourable treatment or a failure to make reasonable adjustments. I don't think any of us can forget the impact of the pandemic and how it exposed the vulnerabilities and the consequences of not having adequate legislative protections against discrimination on the basis of age, race or disability. In our submission, we haven't addressed Section 75 duties of the Northern Ireland Act, simply because its provisions are not devolved to the Assembly. But nevertheless, it would be remiss of me not to say in this forum that Section 75 must be effectively implemented, and we continue to work with the public authorities on this. We need to remember that the duties are about putting people at the heart of policy making. It is about providing an assurance to decision makers, including yourselves as ministers and the Assembly, as well as demonstrating to wider society that the statutory equality duty has been complied with. You will also be aware of the UK Government's commitments under Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, which mean the changes to EU directives impacting upon the directive set out in Annex 1 must be introduced into Northern Ireland law. And we have identified some directives that we consider must be transposed into Northern Ireland law by 2026. Therefore, to comply with this statutory duty, work on preparing the necessary legislation needs to start now. The directives that we consider appropriate are the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the EU Standards for Equality Bodies Directives. Implementing the EU Pay Transparency Directive into Northern Ireland law would lead to greater accountability and transparency by certain employers on gender pay gaps within their organisations, as well as strengthening equal pay measures. The Standards for Equality Bodies Directives aim to strengthen the assistance provided to victims of discrimination in accessing justice and the promotion of equal treatment and prevention of discrimination. The changes would be of great value to individuals in Northern Ireland seeking to redress against discrimination and set out minimum and binding standards for the Commission in respect of the services we deliver. In conclusion, there is much more I could cover in relation to law reform, but I think it's more appropriate that we get an opportunity to have question and answers. I just want to stress that there are clear and persistent weaknesses in equality law in Northern Ireland. Our current legal framework provides limited and inconsistent protections across different equality grounds. That means people struggle to understand their rights, and employers and service providers can be confused about what they are meant to do. Equality law reform will help further advance equality of opportunity, prevent discrimination and clarify the law. It will take time to achieve all of the recommendations, but there is no time like the present to start. But we also need a long-term commitment to modernise our equality law more broadly for the benefit of our individuals, our families, organisations and communities right across all of the equality characteristics. And I just want to make one sort of final pitch. The Commission is not simply an advocacy body for equality. By statute, we are required to be the independent body charged with providing you, our government, with advice, including the appropriateness of equality legislation and the need for reform. We do have the expertise. We are here to work with you to develop the very best equality legislation available for everyone here in Northern Ireland. So thank you for listening, and we're happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Geraldine. And again, thanks for coming along today. So I have a few questions to start off with. You mentioned there in your opening remarks there around the potential or the alternative for an incremental approach, and we know from the New Decade New Approach in terms of the social inclusion strategies that there were some recommendations for standalone pieces of legislation. I'm just wondering, could you speak to how complex a social equality bill would be to introduce, and possibly what the benefits would be from an incremental approach?
Well, an incremental approach will still leave that patchwork. Okay. And we'll be dealing with one sort of specific subject area at a time, while other inconsistencies still exist, and it still leaves that confusion. Going for a single equality bill provides the opportunity to move everything together at the one time. We recognise, whilst that would be our utopia, that it is very difficult to get member buy-in and support and agreement on all of the issues. We have sat for 14 years looking for improvements to equality legislation, and in some respects actually longer than that. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, we've got nowhere. So if we had an agreement that we could take individual pieces, that's making a change for at least some parts of our society. Yeah. I don't think it could take away from the single equality bill and the merits of that, but there are difficulties with resources and with the buy-in of elected members. And I'll ask if either of my colleagues want to add to that.
I suppose just to add in, thank you, Geraldine, for some of the benefits for single equality legislation. It will be really important for individuals to understand their rights, to be able to look to one place and they can see how they're protected against all the different characteristics. But there's also benefits for businesses and service providers. At the minute, they're having to look across 8, 9, 10 different pieces of legislation to understand what their obligations are. So having it in one place would make things easier for everybody. But as Geraldine says, we do recognise that some change is better than no change, and we have laid out some really urgent reforms that are needed now, both in this mandate but also looking ahead. Work needs to start now to see what can be done in the following mandate.
Okay. You mentioned, Geraldine, that there's a statutory duty to keep up to date in line with the equality legislation. Why have there been no consequences on our government for not doing that? And have there been attempts to, give us a wee bit of the political history or the legislative or legal history of why we haven't?
Yeah. Well, I can only personally speak of what I have done over the past 4 years. But the Commission has a long record back since 2004 of starting to talk about legislative reform. And every time we're before any of the committees, we talk about the need for legislative reform. I think that the consequences, there aren't any, apart from the impact on our citizens and our employers and other organisations. There's no penalty within any of the legislation that would penalise government. Okay. The Assembly and Westminster Government are under criticism presently from the committee in relation to their investigation into UNCRPD and the concluding comments that they've just published. That is nothing new. That happens time and time again. But we really need a commitment to tackle the issue. We cannot fall further behind because it's everybody in every section of society who's being failed.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just to say that, there is obligations relating to Article 2 of the Windsor Framework in terms of the keeping pace requirement that Geraldine had mentioned in her opening remarks. And as Geraldine has said, our view, the view of the Commission as well as the Human Rights Commission, is that under obligations in the Windsor Framework, then the UK government does have to keep pace with those directives, the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the directives on standards for quality bodies.
Thank you. Just one last one for me before we move on. So in the Equal Status Acts in Ireland, they have, in terms of protected characteristics, they have membership of the traveller community, and I know that there's a lobby to include, for example, looked after children. So to what degree do you think that these two should be included in those protected characteristics, and if there are any others that should be now that with the passage of time you realise they should have been included in that list?
Catherine wants to come in on this.
So just in terms of the traveller community, there is protections under the Race Relations Order in Northern Ireland.
I meant it as almost like it's a standalone.
So it is within the Race Relations Order at the minute, and there is reference to travellers, so there is protections there, but we know that unfortunately Race Relations Order isn't strong enough, and we all know that there's far too many instances of discrimination towards traveller communities, so we would certainly want to see those protections strengthened in terms of... Can
I just clarify again? So it's under the Section 75?
No, it's Race Relations Order.
Yes, but I'm saying in terms of that list, in terms of the screening and stuff.
The nine characteristics. Yes. That would be within Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act,
yes,
which isn't devolved to the Assembly. Yeah. I think the characteristics that are laid out could do with being reviewed.
Yes.
I think that there was growing pressure that economic disadvantage would also be a characteristic that would be included within that list of the 9 groups. And at the minute there is no provision to do that, and we don't have the ability as a Commission to actually specifically look at economic disadvantage as one of the inequalities, but we do look at the other inequalities through the prism or through the lens of poverty.
Okay.
So I think if that was to be revisited, I think there could be some merit in it, but I would be cautious as well about if you were to identify specific groups of people under the race aspect, that there's always a risk that you could leave someone out. Okay. So it would need careful crafting to make sure that that's the case.
Okay. We as a committee, we're going to try and link in with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee as well around this, so anything that is reserved matters, then we'll certainly be passing that on. Thank you. I'm going to pass on, conscious of time. Connie Egan's our Deputy Chair. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming in today. I really appreciate it. Something I picked up on, which obviously cause of concern is that Section 75 needs to be effectively implemented, and you feel that's just not happening at the minute. How best do you think would be? Do you think we need more legislative provisions, or would that be done purely through policy?
This is something that I think I mentioned when I was last before your committee, that it needed to be reinvigorated. There needed to be a review as to how it was being implemented. And I think a much more pragmatic approach perhaps taken. We have opened up discussions. I have written to the head of civil service with a view to meeting with all of the perm secretaries to consider how they might be encountering some challenges, to look to see how it can be better done. I think from a personal experience or personal position, not speaking entirely for the Commission, I think the stick aspect of the Section 75 really is quite weak. There is potential for greater sanction on a public body that fails to adequately screen and fulfil its Section 75 duties. But those are conversations that are really at very early stages, and I don't have specific recommendations in regard to that yet, because I think it's fair to give the opportunity to public authorities to have their say as well as to how the whole thing could be better implemented, and it becomes actually part of the culture of an organisation, that the equality duty underpins all that they do, and that they don't act in isolation and ignore it and apply it as a last minute tick in the box.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think just one follow up on that was just another thing you'd said around gaps and complexities around disability discrimination and how the legislation needs to harmonise with GB. What kind of gaps are we seeing there, and how would you like us to address those? Could this be something we could see through our inquiry with this committee? Because I think that's something that is especially important, that we don't want to be falling behind at all in any of this areas.
Well, we have already fallen behind, and the introduction of the Equality Act 2010, GB took the opportunity to close those gaps because similar gaps existed in both jurisdictions. We haven't had that opportunity. I'm not too sure. Catherine, you want to come in on the complexities?
Yeah, to be honest, frankly, there's some really strange anomalies in our disability legislation. So in some aspects there's not protection against direct discrimination, which can't be justified, but some places it is. Following case law in GB in 2008, basically it means that discrimination related to disability, it's very hard to take cases now. They've sorted that out now in GB by introducing indirect discrimination and discrimination arising from disability, but we're still in that 2008 phase where it's really difficult for people to take cases forward. There's different definitions used throughout the Act. There's some areas where you can't take harassment cases. It's just really a bit of a mess, to be honest, and really difficult for individuals to understand what their rights are, for organisations to understand what their responsibilities are, and for those who are giving advice to provide clear indications to people what their rights are.
Even something as simple as defining what a disability is. Our legislation is very prescriptive in terms of the list of disabilities or incapacity that the victim must be suffering or enduring, whereas it is much wider within GB. And in some cases we've had to rely on case law here in Northern Ireland by going through the Court of Appeal in terms of including autism as a disability. And I think that's actually rather distressing and demeaning for people who are suffering disabilities, who have to then go and fight to prove that they have that disability.
Okay, thank you. Sinead, please.
Chair, and thank you to you, Geraldine, and the team for coming along today. We've had a terrible summer. And I think when you look at the equality gaps, they're getting bigger and bigger. But the biggest barrier to equality is politics in this place, because we're now the front line of stopping that progress, and that's really regrettable. And we see it played out in our streets and our communities each and every day. I see it in my own city, and it's distressing really, because we haven't dealt with the big issues about discrimination, sectarianism, and everything else. And these things don't go away. They really just bubble, and then eventually we all have the trouble. And so My I suppose, question to you is, you talk in your briefing about the delivery of a comprehensive hate crime law, and as you know, there's debate in the Assembly about a standalone hate crime legislation, which was recommended by the Marianne Review. What's your opinion, on that standalone or the piecemeal piece? And I understand the Minister, wants to deliver, and she thinks the mandate's short, and she, rather than do nothing, do something. And I get all of that. But the last thing we need is legislation that is not comprehensive and doesn't deal with what we have before our eyes and in our streets. And I really want to get this one right when we're moving towards that legislative process.
I think we are really disappointed that it's not a single standalone hate crime bill. The reality is that PSNI are currently encountering difficulties in getting speedy resolution to cases, the court system as well. I think the potential of adding in a more comprehensive clause within the sentencing model or the sentencing bill is advantageous, but there needs to be a commitment to see the rest of it delivered. And that's always my fear with incremental approach to legislative reform, that there might be a willingness to do it now, but the next mandate maybe it's not there, and then you end up, you've still got a piecemeal approach. But in my conversations with PSNI, they would be keen and very supportive of having the sentencing model addressed to include that aggravation of race hate. Catherine, do you want to add to that?
Yes, so certainly we've called for a statutory aggravation model, and it's certainly welcome that seems to be the direction that the Justice Minister is planning to take. Our recommendation was for a comprehensive hate crime legislation that takes in all aspects. As Geraldine says, we do recognise that something is better than nothing. It would be better to see it all in one place, and it's some of those same benefits that we would have with single equality. It's much easier for people to see what their rights are if it's set out clearly in one piece of legislation rather than across the board. So we would continue to want to see comprehensive hate crime legislation, but in its absence we would want to see some of our other recommendations progressed on things like statutory aggravation, expanding protections, clarifying some of the incitement to hatred provisions.
Okay. And I would say one of the reasons that we haven't made adequate progress or any progress in this area is because in the programme for government in 2011 there was a lack of commitment made, and in the programme for government 2024 the issue of racism is mentioned 3 times. LGBT rights are not mentioned once. Disabilities are mentioned 4 times, and older people not at all. Is the programme for government a serious offering when it comes to equality?
Well, we're currently looking at the programme for government, and there is, it's quite obvious there is an absence of specific actions or outcomes, targets, and lines of accountability. So we would be disappointed in terms of what's in it, but I have to say we do welcome the fact that there's a programme for government. We've waited long enough for it. You have quite a short mandate, and resources are really tight. That's no excuse for not addressing equality, because equality underpins all of these issues. It's really hard to take a public policy, any public policy, and separate it out and say that's the remit, standalone, and nobody else or nothing else infringes on it. So, I'll reserve judgment until we make a formal submission in relation to how we consider the impact on equality and inequalities. But there are a number of strategies that are referred to within the document, but there isn't any more information than that. So that's something we'll be feeding back.
Generally, one of the strategies that are not mentioned in the document is an anti-poverty strategy, which to me is it's just like nearly an own goal. Why? Is there no mention of it and urgency in relation to it? And as an equality, as the Commissioner, do you see that as a gap?
I do see that as a gap, and that's why I mentioned earlier on about the socioeconomic status and the ability to include that as one of the characteristics within the 9 grounds under Section 75, the socio-economic, the level of deprivation that impacts on people, because it does underpin a lot of the public policies. And I think, Catherine, you want to come in?
So maybe just to add in, we've sat on the co-design group for that anti-poverty strategy, but it's important to remember as well that it was part of a wider suite of 4 strategies. So there was also disability, sexual orientation or LGBTQI+, and gender equality. And it's really important to see all 4 of those move forward, because they're really intersectional. You know, for instance, there's so many issues around anti-poverty that have particular impacts on women and so on. So it's important that that whole suite moves forward.
I think Roisin would like to come in as well.
Yeah, no, just says disappointing there was nothing in the draft programme for government on equality, law reform, including, for example, on race law reform, which, as Geraldine said, has become even more of an issue now in terms of not having robust legislation here. But just to say, there are a number of things in the draft programme for government that are to be welcomed, like the focus on childcare, the focus on violence against women and girls, and about addressing the needs of children with disabilities and special education needs. So there are positives, but if Geraldine says there's also a number of disappointing aspects.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Harry, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. Geraldine, ladies, good to see you. When you mentioned single equality bill, Geraldine, were your thoughts something like that would be mirroring the GB equality bill of 2010? Was that what you were thinking?
Well, that's the starting point, but I think experience, time has shown difficulties even with the Equality Act 2010, and I think we would like to make good on those mistakes and deficiencies within the legislation. We'd like the opportunity to introduce other aspects that best practice around the world deals with. So it's not a case of just copying across from GB and implementing it here, because they too are having their difficulties in terms of not quite getting it right, and looking for amendments to that too.
So that could be useful. Yeah. And when you mentioned groups like age, racism, disabled, what about religious groups? Were they something that you...
Religious groups are contained within all of our recommendations. I was picking out the more urgent aspects. Your religion beliefs, philosophical beliefs are contained within the Section 75 legislation. Sometimes it's not always very clear in terms of how that's being considered during screening of particular policies. But there is legislative protection as well about discrimination, and that was one of the things that we would have liked to have seen actually contained within a new hate crime legislation too.
Of course. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just before we move on, could you give some examples of how the GB Act is struggling a bit in terms of implementation?
Well, one of the things I would touch on, and I know the others will come in with many more, would be in terms of financial services.
Okay.
They were included within the legislation and then they were exempted. What we learned all over COVID were older people, for example, this is just one example, older people where you need 2-factor identification to be able to access bank accounts or pay things online, don't always have mobile phones.
Yeah, okay.
So they encountered real difficulties. There was also an episode where a lady in her 90s or even older was required to go in and prove her identification because her account was so old.
Okay.
And she didn't have a passport, she didn't have a driving licence, and they wouldn't encounter or even consider anything else, and we had to try to intervene in that even though we don't have a legislative basis for doing it. So there are many aspects of financial services which were taken out of the Equality Act which really need to be in it. Okay. Different types of financial services that people can get. The risk associated with your age, for example, without being able to provide the evidence that age is a factor, those are only the tip of the iceberg.
I'm actually going to move on,
okay.
But I just wanted to pick up on that point because we as a committee, I think we will actually look to see how well that's been implemented. I'm just conscious that other people want to get in. Timothy.
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome along to the committee. This is my first time, so hopefully the chair will keep me right in regarding this. I have a number of things just to take you through, and I want to start with 1.2 of your evidence and the briefing paper you provided to the committee. I want to pull out of it the hierarchy of rights. I suppose starting off, I certainly welcome the Equality Commission's intervention regarding the PSNI's favouritism towards the promotion of LGBT members within the force, where he stated it was unlawful for an employer to discriminate against its employees on the grounds of sexual orientation. But just to expand out on that, have you come across such blatant discrimination anywhere else in the public or private sector? And could you shed any light why the PSNI thought that would be acceptable?
Okay. I think it's fair to say that PSNI as an organisation wasn't necessarily aware that the network were undertaking this particular project. The legislation does allow for affirmative action to be taken, for positive action to be taken, where any particular group is underrepresented within their workforce. But it's how that is done is the issue. We have made contact with PSNI and we have offered to work with them. I myself met with some of the police officers last week, and I offered officers from the Commission to go in and talk to all of their networks, regardless of what section of society they believed they were representing, to talk to them directly about what positive action actually is and the consequences of effectively discriminating against other people.
In this case, the police have basically given them carte blanche.
Timothy, I'm going to stop you there. We're trying to look at gaps in equality legislation in terms of the comparison between here, GB, and the Republic of Ireland.
I think this is something.
Okay, well, I'll let you finish I'll let you finish your question, Timothy. I'll let you finish your question, but it'll be up to you whether you want to respond. Go ahead.
Like the police had gave open door policy where they could use internal email systems, the network. To me, it's inconceivable that this might happen in the Christian Police Association or the Catholic Police Association. So I'm just wondering, is this a case of the LGBT think they have a hierarchy of rights, that they're above the law and they run away with themselves?
I don't think so. I think there are a series of networks within many organisations that are designed to give support and comradeship to particular groups. That doesn't mean to say that they're being treated any more positively or differently from anyone else within the organisation. And I think sometimes some of these organisations or forums or networks, whichever term you want to give it, don't always realise the consequences of their own actions. And I think in this particular example, it was caught on at a very early stage before anyone was discriminated against or potentially discriminated against, and PSNI are dealing with it.
Because of public pressure?
Sorry?
Because of public pressure they come under?
I can't comment on that. I don't know the details of the workings within PSNI, but all I can say is we have offered PSNI support to go in and talk to the various networks that they have, educate them and inform them of the legislative requirements and how best that they might move forward without disadvantaging anyone else within their organisation.
Quickly moving on to 1.4 and picking out the sex, gender reassignment and pregnancy. Certainly look at it. What gaps do you think that exists when it comes to gender reassignment, and does the Commission recognise the conflict between the rights of a woman and a biological man claiming or thinking that he is a woman? Do you believe, as a Equality Commission...
Can you watch your language, please? Thank you.
Do you believe a biological man should have access to female-only spaces?
This is a very fast-moving area where there are different pieces of evidence and information coming to light. But can I say that in Northern Ireland, we are very welcome of the fact that those who represent various groups, trans people, etc., the likes of the Rainbow Project, are working very closely with women's groups to make sure that the rights of women and those who are transitioning are protected and respected. They have an exceptionally good working relationship with each other. They have respect for each other, something that is not always guaranteed and assured across other jurisdictions. But I think they're both to be congratulated in how they're working together. And I would like to see that relationship that they have protected and not disadvantaged in any way or demeaned in any way, to allow them to work through the issues, that they can come to a sensible solution whilst protecting the rights of women and others. There are spaces within society that are women only and should be women only.
Will continue to be women only?
They very much will do in terms of very specific circumstances. But as I said, it's a fluid area. We have a lot of work as a commission to do in this field, as has wider society in terms of understanding the needs of all of these people. But at this moment in time, we as a commission are very grateful to the open and respectful discourse that's taken place between all of the women's groups and those lobbyists acting on behalf of those who are transitioning from one gender to another.
Moving on to 1.10.
Is this your last question?
My last series of questions, it's built into this
Okay.
one, so be as quick as
Make
I
it
can,
quick,
Chair.
please, thank
Yep,
you.
absolutely.
Thank you.
So obviously here that nobody from Northern Ireland essentially has any input into formulating EU directives. I don't believe that is the case anywhere else in the world where there be such an undemocratic process in place where we're overseen by laws we do not make and run by a foreign court. Does the Equality Commission respect the outcome of the 2016 referendum?
Absolutely. And we also respect the commitment made by the UK government in terms of the Windsor Framework and before it the Northern Ireland Protocol, where it set out in partnership and agreement with the EU that 6 directives that impacted on equality in Northern Ireland would be protected and there would be a keep and pace aspect to that. And as such, there are certain EU directives that impact on those 6 directives, which are solely to do with equality, not to do with trade or any other aspect, that need to be monitored to see how they impact on the, in terms of any future changes that are coming from Europe. The UK government has already identified that, or confirmed to us, that the pay transparency, the equality bodies directives, actually fall within scope of those 6 directives. And that is them actually saying we need to move forward with it. There are various levels of committee and escalation where if the UK government fails to deliver on its commitments, that they can be raised. But this is totally separate from all aspects of trade or internal market or differentiating Northern Ireland from the UK. It is on the basis...
You were going way off topic here in terms of the committee.
But
in terms of... I might bring you in at the end if we've got time. Go ahead, Claire, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for coming to present to us. I share your comments around the lack of equality presented within the programme for government, because if everybody can't access services and improvements, then what are we doing it for? So hopefully as a draft it might be something that the executive will consider. One of the areas, and we talked about this last week, I have started the process in terms of a private members bill for age discrimination in relation to goods, facilities and services. So hopefully we can close that gap that exists in Northern Ireland. But I do think it would be a sad indictment of this executive if the only piece of equality legislation or action was taken through a private members bill, and one that has been sitting on the books for over 15 years. You and I will engage, many times in relation to this. I have no doubt. I suppose it's kind of come back to your comments around a single equality. I understand the utopia idea around it. I must admit I'm not a great lover of catch-all bills, because I think they're open to being reshaped into other areas, and I think it gives scope, maybe where we won't then get final agreement on it. So I suppose it's really to see that I think it is a realistic position that we do it almost in this piecemeal way so that we can at least get something in place. But how confident are you that we are going to get anything more in terms of this mandate? Because mindful that we are 2.5 years left. And
I think time is very short to be able to deliver on meaningful and widespread legislative reform, given the stages that are involved in that process. But there are certain aspects of legislative reform that I've identified here: the race, the age, disability, where so much has already been done. It's almost at that final hurdle. I think the age one, particularly, so much work was done back in 2015-16, just before the mandate finished. And it was a couple of issues that really caused a stumbling block. And I know they need to be resolved, but we hold the view that age protections need to be for everyone. To curtail that to a particular group or to set an age limit on it is in itself discriminatory. And I think perhaps it wasn't recognised as fully as maybe it should have been, that it is not to take away from parental rights or to usurp other social policy or bylaws or regulations. There are ways and means of setting out very clearly the level of protections that are retained at different levels. So I think that can move very quickly. The race, again, is at a very advanced stage, although we have yet to see the draft regulations and legislation. I think that's really important, given our statutory role in that area, to be able to comment on the appropriateness of it. It would be an awful shame to get to a very late stage and then for us to come back and be critical of it. And the same with some of the others.
Right, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose then, just even thinking through that, in terms of the areas that you've suggested that we could progress, they are at very final stages. So, might it be an idea that other members might take them forward as private members' bill? Ideally, it should be the government doing it because of the scope and the nature and the work that's involved. But, is that something that, we could support and maybe encourage other members to do?
I can say that at the minute we have a very wide list of private member bills that are making their way through the Commission, and we will work with anyone who brings forward a private member's bill. We will give advice and guidance where we possibly can. I've already told you of our statutory remit in terms of providing advice and guidance. So any member's bill comes our way and we have a remit in that area, we will certainly work with the member involved. So you've got that assurance.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Carol, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Geraldine, and your team for presenting it to the committee. I just want to ask a few different questions. So first of all, I appreciate the briefing paper. It was very detailed and some of those discussions have already happened. But in terms of equality screening currently, I would like to see that included as a gap, because I know that certainly when it comes to Section 75, as it's often set aside for good relations. So because there's no definition of good relations in legislation, how can you and we ensure that the screening exercise is as in-depth as it is, and if not, what should be done? And then the other aspect is around, good relations is promoted over equality implications quite a lot, particularly by local government. So that's my first question.
Okay. Well, in terms of our submission, we haven't dealt with Section 75, as I've told you, because it's a reserved matter. But we're more than happy to provide you with a briefing specifically on Section 75 if you want to take it forward with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. More than happy to do that. I agree with you that there's a different emphasis placed on the equality duty as there is about promoting good relations. And I think it's the way in which it is phrased and the terminology that's used, it weakens the good relations aspect. And I'd like to see that strengthened. The Commission would generally like to see that strengthened. We have concerns about the way in which the screening of policies is undertaken in some cases, and we have made a number of recommendations. We are now working with all of the departments within the civil service about how they screen and how they identify those policies that will have negative impacts on any of the groups and how they might mitigate that. And trying to find a way to have a new drive put into embedding this within the culture of every single department within the civil service. It is not a tick box exercise. It never should have been. But I think the very fact that we talk about it as Section 75 illustrates the point. It is about putting people at the heart of public policy. And while we use Section 75, it's just tick a box.
So I appreciate that. And I mean, you will know as participants in the co-production and co-design of the social strategies that I'm sure those points were made ad nauseum. But the issue for us is that we had a very robust process and you fed into it around the Bill of Rights, and it was rejected by most of the unionist parties. My concern is that because there's political blockages, who's going to lift those equality gaps in absence of political agreement? Surely there's a statutory obligation on yourselves and the Human Rights Commission.
As I said earlier on, we have a statutory remit to keep various pieces of equality legislation under review. And some people don't necessarily recognise that, because the Northern Ireland Act that gives the birth of the Equality Commission, it makes reference to our predecessor organisations and the fact that we are assuming their powers and duties and responsibilities. So you need to go back to the primary legislation to see where all of our powers and duties are actually derived. But we do have that remit. We are not always listened to. We have been lobbying and advocating for 14 years and more in relation to law reform. And I don't want to have to keep on doing it. But the reality is, the powers in terms of making you do it, you know, the Assembly is the legislature. It is you who need to do it. We can't do that for you. We do have the power to actually draft certain pieces of legislation and put it before you, but you're the people who have to approve it.
Yeah, no, I hear your frustration, Jordan, because we are all fed up, you know, promising particularly marginalised groups that, you know, any gaps will be filled, and then when it comes down to the crunch, it gets vetoed, and that for me is completely unacceptable. Chair, just a last point. See, in relation to good relations and equality, my point, just to be totally clear in this, good relations is being, you know, promoted over equality. So if you look at even some of the committee papers, or you look at some of the exercises that the departments have done, they've used, you know, they've used good relations as a reason not to do something because there's an inequality there. And that has happened time and time again. So, for example, if you're talking about building houses in areas where there's highest demand, huge inequality, we've had statutory bodies saying we can't build them there because it'll not be good for relations, rather than saying we need to build them there in order to meet equality or inequalities. So that's something that I believe that needs to be part of this inquiry, in terms of the very need for a clear definition of what good relations is compared to equality duties, which are statutory bound and compelling.
I think within Section 75, it's a due regard, a duty in terms of equality, but it's have regard to the building of good relations.
Absolutely.
And I think there is some merit in terms of the value that's placed on both of those, but the higher legal weight is given to the equality duty under that particular piece of legislation.
Okay, thank you. Emma, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you all for the presentation and the answers thus far. I suppose my question sort of relates to some of the points that have been made. Obviously, Sinead referred at the start to the summer that we've had, and it has been difficult, and we've seen marginalised communities across the north targeted in a very real way, and all of the accompanying rhetoric around that and how damaging and scary that was for people. And even today, in the course of this meeting, we've seen two marginalised groups be pitted against each other. And you referred there to the fact that there hasn't been political agreement for single equality legislation, and obviously, as the previous chair and co-member along with Paula and Carol of the Bill of Rights Committee, I seen in a very real way how we carried out all of that work. We seen that there was a public appetite for a Bill of Rights, an outstanding agreement since 1998, and we weren't able to see it over the line because it was vetoed. I wonder, why is it that those minority objectors to rights and objectors to equality for everyone are allowed to block and are amplified to the extent that they are? Have you any thoughts on that? Given your capacity?
That's sort of getting into the structure and the constitution of the Assembly, and I don't have a remit in that regard.
Yeah.
Remember, I'm sorry, but
in terms of the gaps in equality that we have here, and trying to bridge those gaps.
What I would say about equality is, it is not the remit or the privilege of one section of society, whether you're unionist, nationalist, or anything else. There are still old people right across the spectrum. There are still disabled people across the spectrum. There are still people from ethnic minorities caught in the middle. It is not a zero-win game.
That's I suppose where my frustration is, because over the course of the Bill of Rights process, we've seen that there was appetite across all communities for an extension of rights, and the people who are being actively discriminated against now and the people who are in a rights deficit are no longer, the nationalist community in the way that we would have seen 50, 60, 70 years ago in this place. But how do we raise that? How do we elevate that? How do we get solution to that for those
under the present legislative framework? There isn't anything at our disposal that we can force elected members to actually make a decision and to agree a way forward. All we can do is put the evidence before you and demonstrate very clearly that equality of opportunity, being treated with respect and dignity, is the right of every single person in Northern Ireland society, regardless of your religion or your political outlook on life. And we will continue to drive that home as best we can, because it's about equality of opportunity. It's about giving everyone the potential to develop, to improve. Our children deserve the right to avail of every opportunity that's presented to them. But if we don't create a level playing field for that child, they're always going to be in the disadvantaged end of things. You can take any inequality you like, and the differences between nationalists, unionists, Catholic, Protestant, any other religion, it impacts right across the spectrum. And we're not in the game of promoting one group more than another. We're here for every citizen in Northern Ireland, tackling all inequalities wherever they exist. If that helps your answer.
Yeah, no, I suppose it's just the frustration, because that's what I'm saying.
I'm exceptionally frustrated by it.
In terms of the communities that we represent, there's not a nationalist unionist divide in terms of rights. We've seen that, or evidence showed us that very clearly, that everybody was in support of an extension of rights, but it still was blocked. So that's the challenge for us all. Thanks, Chair.
Two things just before bringing you in, Brian. First of all, we are going to write to the Secretary of State. We haven't let that drop off the agenda around the Bill of Rights, but obviously this inquiry is separate too, although obviously there's no overlap. And secondly, we as a committee can bring forward legislation. We can bring forward our own bill too, so that maybe might be one of the outcomes of this process, because I'm determined that we don't have another process, that there's no output at the end of it. Brian, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance and presentation. In particular for your two-page summary document. That's very helpful on a day that we have over 1,500 pages on our file. So,
you saw the original one, that's that big?
Yes, well, this is particularly helpful. I mean, we do also have the raised document, which is very helpful too, the comparative study for quality legislation in the United Kingdom and Ireland. So, no, they're both informative for us. I do expect some of these things will be easier to move forward and we'll have broader consensus. Some are going to be more complicated in terms of looking at all the consequences, not least for employers, who look at ever increasing, requirements on them. But this is helpful. Just wanted to say that, particularly that summary, and certainly we'll discuss with colleagues as we seek to advance these matters, in a balanced manner. So, okay, just thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that.
You want us very quick, and it better be in line with the committee inquiry. Thank you.
I certainly hope it is this time, Chair. Just wanting to get your thoughts on the EU Counter-Terrorism Directive, which defines a victim as a neutral person or a natural person. That conflicts with the definition of a victim in the 2006 Victim and Survivors Order, which is obviously local legislation. How do you marry that up? That one set of legislation where you're saying we have to follow the EU directive doesn't include a victim maker as a victim, whereas Northern Ireland legislation does.
Can I just sort of interrupt you there and say that this is largely outside of our remit, but there are certain aspects that may fall within our remit in terms of the EU directive.
Like this is outside trade and all the different characteristics you named before.
Well, just to say, if the directive was passed prior to the EU exit, prior to the end of the Brexit transition period, then the UK would be required to implement that directive in full. So that would have been a statutory obligation to give effect to that directive. So I'm not aware that there has been a gap in implementation. It's certainly something we can take away and get back to you on, but we wasn't aware that, particularly because it's not a specific equality law directive, wasn't aware that there was a particular problem with limitation, but can certainly find that out for you and come back if that would be helpful.
So, in your interpretation, the 2006 Victims and Orders, or Survivors Order, trumps the EU Counter-Terrorism Directive?
Counter-terrorism does not fall within our remit, and to make a comment or offer a view on it at this time would probably be misleading for you and inappropriate for us, but we're happy to have a look at it and see if it does, any aspect of it falls within our remit, and come back to you directly through the chair, if that would be helpful.
Appreciate that.
Okay, that's great. We're on time, 3 o'clock. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, committee members, for your succinct questions. So thank you. We will keep you posted. If there's anything that occurs to you after you walk out the door that you'd like us to have on our radar, please do come back to us, but we really appreciate your time and effort today.
Just on the point of the Section 75 and the workings with the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, would it be helpful if we provided you with some detail on our views in relation to that and how it's working and the equality versus good relations aspect of that?
Yes, thank you.
Happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. So, members, moving on then, we're just about to take our second evidence session, and you'll find the clerk's brief is on page 88, and the PAC response from the Equality Coalition on page 90. So I'm going to welcome to the meeting then. So we've got Daniel Holder, Director of the Committee for Administration and Justice and co-convener of the Equality Coalition. We've got Patricia McKeown, who's the Regional Secretary of Unison and co-convener of the Equality Commission, and Eliza Browning, who is the Senior Policy Officer at the Committee for Administration and Justice. So thank you all for attending today. You're very welcome to committee, and thank you also for your submission in advance. So it was very comprehensive. Really appreciate that. So if you'd like to just give them a wee second to get themselves sorted. I'm always rushing on. Got everything you need? Could we have a glass, please, for Eliza? Oh, sorry, I couldn't see it behind the thing. Okay. Patricia, are you leading?
Thank you very much,
okay,
Chair.
Thank you.
Committee members, thank you for the opportunity. We do welcome this invitation. We've provided in advance our written evidence and the opportunity to provide oral evidence today. I should say that as the Equality Coalition, we are the eternal optimists. We have been presenting evidence, written and oral, and in other forms for more than a quarter of a century, and we do hope that at some point what we say will end up with improved equality tools and legislation to advance the issue that is at the core of all of our work, which is a better life for the people of Northern Ireland, and a particular emphasis on the areas and groups of greatest need. So to introduce the coalition itself, we've been in existence for more than a quarter of a century. We came together based on what we hoped would eventually be the core of the Section 75 groups in the Northern Ireland Act, in order to influence the equality and rights outcomes of the peace agreement, and then eventually the Northern Ireland Act 98 itself. And we have stayed in existence, and we have grown from strength to strength since then. Today, the coalition is made up of more than 100 civil society organisations across Northern Ireland, with the collective aim of creating that better society, that rights-based society that we're talking about, one that is based on real equality outcomes. So we are non-governmental organisations, we are trade unions, we work cumulatively across all the 9 equality categories, and beyond those Section 75 categories into other protected equality grounds. We provide a forum for unity between multiple sectors when campaigning for equality, and we are the representative forum for the entire equality sector, and I think recognised as such. Our coalition has a long track record of campaigning for the full implementation of the rights-based commitments in the peace agreement, and for compliance with international treaty-based obligations, including single equality legislation and the implementation of the Section 75 statutory equality duty. And it is in those two key areas that we're centring this submission. But I should say that when you do look at our submission, I'm sure you already have done, but you will see reference to what in fact is a body of more than a quarter of century of detailed research, recommendations, proposals from us collectively as a coalition, but also from those organisations that form the membership of the coalition. And that is a body of work that is absolutely vital to the issues you're addressing at the moment. I want to pass on to Daniel to take us through these core issues we're addressing.
So we have three issues within a submission. One's around single equality legislation, the second is around enforcement of the equality duty, and the third is about the good relations duty. So to take the first one, as we know, Northern Ireland still has no single equality legislation, and presently there's no plan to take it forward within the programme for government. We think all the technical work has really been done to set this up. The Equality Commission has done a good job of mapping the gaps in equality law. We've also, over the years, numerous treaty body recommendations on how single equality legislation should be taken forward, needed to comply with international obligations as well as peace process commitments. But we have a frustrating political blockage over that despite majority support. And that's frustrating for rights holders and for our sector, given the gaps in protection that leaves. It's also frustrating for employers and service providers too, who are having to deal with numerous statutes rather than one comprehensive overarching act. If the political blockage remains, other options the committee could recommend would be for the UK government to take forward the long overdue Bill of Rights, which would have, as advised by the Human Rights Commission, would have required provisions on new legislation to end unfair discrimination, or in the alternative as well, for the UK government to ratify Protocol 12 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which also provides for a requirement for freestanding equality legislation and could compel legal requirements in this jurisdiction to bring forward legislation. So that's the first issue. The second issue is around the Section 75 equality duty, and we very much question whether the legislative framework of enforcement and the actions of enforcement by the Equality Commission are sufficient over the duty. We've found them to be quite ineffective in this end. So Section 75, as committee members will know, was a core part of the Good Friday Agreement, and it was meant to operate as an objective legal safeguard with an objective threshold. So it was to allow public authorities and officials to impact assess either whether a policy could promote equality or whether a policy would, in essence, constitute a discriminatory detriment. The word adverse impact is used in the legislation, but that's what it means. It means where a piece of where a policy is essentially a discriminatory detriment on a Section 75 ground, and then what it was to do was trigger duties to consider alternative policies or mitigating measures. That's how it's supposed to work. And there's a two-stage methodology of equality screening and then, when necessary, full equality impact assessment. We have a fair bit of research into this. We have two reports in particular, the Equal to the Task report, the Equality Duty Enforcement Project report, and we found that notwithstanding pockets of good practice, there's regular flouting of this duty by public authorities in many ways. They include just not doing equality screening at all, or doing it very rarely doing EQAAs, or just doing equality screening in a sort of box-ticking tokenistic matter, just saying the impact is great for everyone, the impact's the same for everyone without a proper analysis of the policy. But a point is here, the duty is supposed to have teeth. It's supposed to have enforcement. In some circumstances, it's been amenable to judicial review, which has been successful. But there's meant to be also a statutory remedy through the Equality Commission. And we have very significant concerns about deficiencies in how the Commission has exercised those powers. They would centre on really long and at times inexplicable delays in dealing with complaints and taking forward complaints, and also the Commission declining to actually use its powers of enforcement or investigation in relation to most of the valid complaints it receives. So we agree that that there should be a review, and the Commission itself has the power to trigger an independent review under the Northern Ireland Act of the effectiveness of the Section 75 duties, but that must encompass how the Commission itself has exercised its enforcement powers, and if and how that legislative framework or even policy framework could be strengthened. The third and final area then is the good relations duty. The second limb of the Section 75 duties wasn't in the Good Friday Agreement, but a good relations duty was added to it as two primary issues of concern about how it's operating. First is there's a very significant legislative gap in that good relations is not defined on the face of the Northern Ireland legislation, and that's despite repeated recommendations that it should be. They've come from international treaty bodies in terms of international obligations, and also from other places, including the FEC Committee. Now, the Equality Act in Great Britain defines good relations, and clearly it's not intended to be a completely different concept. It defines good relations as tackling prejudice and promoting understanding across protected equality grounds. International standards have defined good relations in a similar way, also referencing duties around integration and combating discrimination. The Equality Commission has recommended good definitions as well along those lines. Yet no definition in the legislation means that what quite often happens is a lay definition of good relations is just invented. And essentially that lay definition is whether the policy is politically contested, or whether it's contended, or whether some parties are angry about the policy proposal. That's not what that's not what good relations is supposed to mean in terms of the legislation. It's certainly not what the equality duty, the Section 75 duties were supposed to be about. This is then compounded by a second problem. The second problem is that although the legislation on the Section 75 duties is very, very expressly clear that the duties around impact assessment, the duties to assess adverse impacts, i.e. discriminatory detriments in particular, and the duties to consider alternative policies and mitigating measures only relate to the equality limb of the duty. They are not tied to the good relations limb of the duty. And most of the Equality Commission guidance says the same thing. However, in 2010, the Commission, outside the framework of that legislation and in contradiction to its other guidance, did recommend that public authorities within equality screening also conducted good relations impact assessments. And there's a real question about what that actually means. What is a good relations impact if there's no definition? And it ends up being the exact opposite of what the legislation was supposed to be, which is an objective measure of whether something is compliant with or is in conflict with equality law. It becomes a subjective veto. So a combination of these two factors really has frustrated the whole purpose of the equality duty, because the focus ends up being on a lay assessment of good relations impacts rather than an objective assessment as to whether there is discriminatory detriments. We've seen this in numerous policies, the purpose of which, in fact, it's usually deployed against policies, the purpose of which is to enhance equality and human rights. Housing is one example. We've seen it deployed against same-sex marriage, which clearly promotes equality, but then a pushback that it was damaging somehow to good relations, same-sex marriage equality. And then we've also seen it in Irish language policies, and other socioeconomic rights policies, up to including policies on free school meals. So we've really seen a situation whereby the purpose of the duty can be flipped on its head by these lay good relations impact assessments. And our recommendations are around that are, let's consolidate a definition, there's one there. And secondly, as some public authorities have already done, actually remove the good relations impact assessment questions from equality schemes. And also, we would recommend that the Commission rescinds that recommendation given the chaos it has caused.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And again, there's a lot in that paper, and I could pick out some of it from what you were saying there. So this is probably a subjective first question for yourselves, and it comes back to your opening remarks there, Patricia, that you have been doing this for a quarter of a century. And I'm just wondering, to what degree have societal changes sort of moderated how we support those people or remove barriers to discrimination over the last 25 years? In other words, have we seen that society has moved way ahead of where legislation should be?
It's just fair to say that parts of society are, but the truth of the matter is that poverty and division have deepened in this society, and these are absolutely critical issues that we had hoped that a quarter of a century of implementing genuine equality tools, rights tools, would bring us to a different outcome than we are in today. That frustration that we've experienced about the blocking of forward progress, that has become worse rather than better. I would say that for the first 50% of our existence as an equality coalition, we did direct business, with direct engagement with, first of all, direct rule, then with the Northern Ireland Assembly, particularly through its junior ministers, and a succession of secretaries of state and government ministers during the various periods of suspension. But in recent years, we've kind of drawn away from the engagement, for example, with the junior ministers, who would be the obvious people we would want to sit down and do business with, because we could not get any consensus. Mm-hmm. And, you know, doesn't Einstein says, keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome? Therein lies what madness. So we stopped doing that. We've got to have a different approach, or ultimately, you've got to have a different approach. You're the people we elect. And there is nobody, no political party, no politician who has stood on a platform promoting the widening of inequality or the deepening of poverty. So our frustration is that the tools are there. Those tools, back in '98, when we had the first iteration of the peace agreement, were hailed as some of the best, certainly way in advance of what was available across the rest of the UK or on these islands, or indeed in many instances on an international basis. And we find ourselves in 2024 more than a decade behind, for example, GB, but well behind many other jurisdictions who drew from our experience in order to improve their own tools for better policy making. And it's about better, most of this, Section 75 in particular, was designed to create better policy making. That shouldn't be, a tool of fear for anyone. That should be what we all seek to achieve. We, however, are still committed to working in collaboration and partnership wherever we can with the decision makers, the policy makers, the legislators. We do believe that civil society has a great deal to offer, and that our efforts to try and make life better should be matched by efforts of our elected politicians to do the straightforward business of improving those equality tools and stop blocking.
Just on that, so we have the Single Equality Act in GB, and then we've got the Equal Status Acts of Ireland. Now, I'm not across every clause within both of those, but if both those jurisdictions, I know GB isn't just a composite jurisdiction, but if they were able to move forward and bring different strands of society and stakeholder groups like disability all together into these single bills, what has been the justification for why we haven't kept pace in terms of harmonising our, like I've sat in the health portfolio for 7 years, so I'm genuinely not across the detail of why, when GB and Republic of Ireland have been able to move forward, why we haven't been able to do it here.
I mean, that's down to, in part, the structures that weren't properly put in place around the Good Friday Agreement, around how the institutions would operate. When you look back at the agreement and what was committed to, we were meant to have rights-based safeguards. We were not supposed to have subjective political vetoes. Even things like the petition of concern were not supposed to operate as the basis of a blocking mechanism. They were meant to be a tool whereby a proposed policy was measured against, where a committee would be established every time a petition of concern was tabled to measure the proposed legislation or policy against the standards in the ECHR, Equality Law and the Bill of Rights. And then only really when those standards were breached were things supposed to be stopped. What we've ended up with is structures of just whereby the opponents of equality have disproportionate power and have a veto, and therefore can prevent progress when there is majority support, even within the executive and the assembly, and particularly the vetoes that were introduced in the context of St Andrews have compounded that problem and essentially ground progress to a halt. If you look at the history of the Single Equality Act, and we've set out a bit of the narrative in a submission. You had an international agreement, part of the agreements of the peace process, as well as numerous treaty body recommendations that this had to be taken forward. You had the work done under direct rule until the institutions were established in 2007. You then had 4 other 5 parties in favour of taking forward the Single Equality Act. But one clearly not, and it didn't happen. It was debated in the Assembly, wasn't then put in the programme for government, and therefore hasn't been taken forward. So it's been done in other jurisdictions, but not here.
Okay, just a quick one, then I'm going to open it up. So, in terms of the equality screening duty, and it says in your papers there about the Equality Commission to provide the practical guidance for those to be delivered. I'm just wondering if you could speak to whether there's the capacity within our public service, civil service to actually deliver on those. You know, it's one thing getting the guidance, but it's another thing actually being able to do the proper analysis. I'm just wondering, is there an issue there in terms of how these are delivered when they're out there within the departments?
Yeah, there is certainly an issue. It's regularly flouted, but it's not that complex. Yes, there is an issue of training. There is an issue around other things, but we think the real gap is enforcement. When things get enforced, they will have to be done properly.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. Sinead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Honestly, it's so depressing. It really is depressing to actually have this evidence again and this presentation again. It's a circular failure, and we've got to overcome it. And I think, Daniel, you said something there, you know, it's the structure of government, it's the veto, it's, you know, we need to reform these institutions, and this is not about even collapsing government, this is about being able to do government when we're in government. And that is a political failure as well. So I want to ask you around that definition piece about good relations, because I think this is a really fundamental piece about the definition as well. You know, Daniel, maybe if we can look at what it actually means in relation to some of the work that this committee is trying to do. For example, the FIC report about, you know, the fundamentals of flags and our culture and our emblems, and that. We get stuck each time we come to look at some of this big piece of work in this executive around the equality issues, around what it means, what we mean by good relations. Like for this year in Derry, there is so many flags in our city, and they're hate flags as well, and they're everywhere. It is driving really poor relations. And we have nothing in our remit and the authorities to tackle these areas of hate crime and sectarianism because we haven't dealt with the equality issues. We would sort out so much and make so much progress within Northern Ireland if we got the structures right, the definitions right, and the legislation right, and we would release the authorities to deal with some of the bigger issues, and we would drive a more cohesive and inclusive society, and we would deal with our inequalities in a much better way. And that definition, and closing those gaps, is fundamental for us to actually drive our economy, to drive wealth and prosperity, and we're being held back by these. You know, it might sound as if we're kind of nearly being academic about some of this stuff because we're talking about it in that academic piece about what we need in legislation, but it's holding whole of society back. It's holding our housing back, it's holding our government back, it's holding everything back, and that's why we get into the cycle of actually doing nothing, because it's too difficult, because we haven't dealt with it. How do we move the definition piece, for example, on without making any part or any political party feel that they're under threat as a result of it?
Well, on a number of those things, picking up the hate crime piece and the issue of, say, racist expression in public space, which has been a very live issue over the summer, whilst we welcome bits of the hate crimes bill being prioritised, and the aggravated sentences model is very important. We know there's less time in this mandate. To us, it's very important that recommendation 15 of the hate crimes review, which was the statutory duty to remove, to take reasonable steps for relevant public authorities to take reasonable steps to remove racist, sectarian and other forms of hate expression from public space, is also taken forward as a matter of urgency as part of this package, because of the, as well as a lot of the measures around misogyny that were in the hate crimes piece as well, to make sure that they're urgently addressed as well. We think that recommendation that really focuses on the most harmful forms of expression is the way to begin to move on this, and hopefully there will be no one who's against the removal of blatantly racist hate expression that constitutes intimidation etc., from public space. In terms of the definitional piece, I think there are international obligations there. One way to move forward on the definitions is for public authorities, departments, arm's length bodies to amend the definition of good relations in their own equality schemes. That's not too difficult. They just have to resubmit them to the Commission. Some public authorities have done that. The Commission has accepted it. And to draw a definition that's around international standards. So the definition that the Council of Europe has recommended, which is not too dissimilar to the definition under the Equality Act 2010, is that promoting good relations between different groups in society entails fostering mutual respect, understanding and integration, whilst continuing to combat discrimination and intolerance. I don't think anyone could have any legitimate concerns about any of those concepts. The Council of Europe treaty bodies have already raised significant concerns that the good relations duty in the way it's currently interpreted has taken priority over equality and minority rights initiatives that were blocked on grounds that they could lead to community tensions. And I think that's the key. It's removing the suggestion that this is just a veto because someone is angry about a policy, and actually replacing a definition with that's grounded in international standards. Ideally, the legislation would be amended. I know that has to be done at Westminster. It could still be recommended by this committee. It would only be drawing the legislation in line with the GB legislation. It's not intended to be a different concept. But as an interim measure, public authorities, government departments and others, a number of councils have already done this, could simply amend the definition in their equality schemes, and that would bind them to using that as a definition, as well as removing the good relations impact assessments questions, which would then allow them to focus on those types of things, positive action on fostering mutual respect, understanding and integration, rather than using this just as a political veto.
Yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead, Timothy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for coming along and providing your evidence. This coalition, this network is certainly new to myself, and just to give me a bit of background, does the committee have any representatives from the victims' organisations? If so, who are they?
Well, there's we've over 100 members. I'm trying to think, but I mean, we've loads. I mean, we've lots of ethnic minority groups, victims of racist violence. We've lots of LGBT groups, obviously victims of discrimination in that area. We've the entire women's sector who honestly face systemic discrimination. So we've numerous victims, yes, rights holders represented on the Equality Coalition.
When we established the Equality Coalition, we also established another coalition that was centering on securing an enforceable Bill of Rights. And it has a number of victims' organisations. We're members of both, right? And it has WAVE. It has when we did a lobby of Washington to secure some US government backing for a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland, we were represented by the Disabled Police Officers Association, arguing very strongly for an enforceable Bill of Rights. Those victims' organisations work within I think they have their own networks as well. But yes, we do business. Some are in, and some are in more than one coalition.
I suppose it's just to lead in and give me a bit more background. You talk about a relevant criminal record. Within your dictionary for the coalition, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, this is a reference to the Bill of Rights recommendations by the Human Rights Commission in 2008, that they should look at introducing the protected ground of a relevant criminal conviction into anti-discrimination legislation. This was to deal with issues around the reintegration of prisoners, both prisoners with conflict-related convictions and others, but it's not that. But the word irrelevant is important there. Quite clearly, if someone applies for a job in a bank and has a string of convictions for fraud, then it would be reasonable to think they might not be the most appropriate candidate for that job. However, the barriers that ex-prisoners face in a conflict resolution process to reintegration and the much broader issues in terms of former offenders and their reintegration as well could be dealt with by having that as an equality ground. And it was part of the advice to the Secretary of State that the Human Rights Commission issued way back in 2008.
So, based on your answer, do you think that people engaged in the terrorist campaign in Northern Ireland should
Timothy,
then
just
be
stop for a
classed?
second.
Yes.
Can we come back to the subject matter today? We are looking for gaps in equality legislation between Northern Ireland and GB and the Republic of Ireland.
I think it's important to get the context of where the group is coming from.
No, I don't think it is. I'm going to rule that out of order. Move on to your next question, please, or I'm going to move on to the next member. Thank
There
you.
is a statutory duty on the executive office to look after the interests of victims, and it seems to be.
We have
from
had
what we
sessions, and we will
have
have sessions
front of
again.
us,
We have had sessions.
that's not the case.
Excuse me, I'm speaking. We've had sessions with victims groups and we will continue to have them. Today we are taking evidence in relation to gaps in equality legislation. Next question please, thank you.
Moving on to the next point I wanted to raise, it talks about mutual political vetoes can prevent progress. Would you like to see an end to minority rights or protections for minorities? Is that what your evidence is suggesting?
No, we want to see a beginning to minority rights and the enforcement of the international treaty obligations that were signed up to as part of the Good Friday Agreement. By mutual political vetoes, we're referring again, and I did go through some of this earlier, our position is pretty clear. We want to return to the framework that was committed to under the Good Friday Agreement, whereby there'd be rights-based safeguards, not subjective political vetoes. When I say subjective political vetoes, I'm referring to the way the good relations duty has been misinterpreted. I'm also referring to the veto that was not in the Good Friday's Agreement but was introduced as a result of St Andrews, which prevents individual ministers from taking decisions on very subjective grounds, i.e. that they are significant or controversial. That's not tied to rights-based standards. The whole premise of the agreement was that you protect minority rights by having minority rights and human rights safeguards, and that means no minorities' rights can be infringed, but that actually has to mean the real rights of minorities. It doesn't mean the ability to block rights and to block legislation that actually promotes rather than infringes rights.
Your evidence, you brought up the topic of the Irish language. There's nothing in your evidence which talks about the freedom of assembly and the right to cultural expression. Is that reflective of your membership list in the network?
This is a submission on gaps in equality law, and the section you're referring to is about additional protected characteristics in equality law, and we're suggesting that language, which is only protected currently under the European Convention, there's no real protection for Irish and Ulster Scots speakers against discrimination, and therefore that could be added as a ground. If you'd like to visit our website, you'll find huge amounts of reports and information that cover things like freedom of assembly, right to protest, and various other human rights issues. But obviously what's in our submission to your inquiry on gaps in equality law relates to gaps in equality law rather than broader human rights issues.
I'll certainly take you up on that offer. From what has been submitted to the committee today, to me it looks like a political submission and not an independent one, but I certainly will do more. I'll do more research in the organisation for when you come back to the committee in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, please. Oh, sorry, Carol, we can't hear you. But your microphone's on. Hold on, we'll just check. Do you mind if I bring Emma in and then we'll come back to you, Carol? Is that okay? Okay, go ahead, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you
sorted.
all for your presentation and for your answers already. And I suppose I would share the frustrations of many in the committee around the battle that's been going on for over 25 years, as you have referred to. I suppose my question, and I appreciate your submission, and particularly I know we keep going on and on and on about it, but the reference to the need for a Bill of Rights, and I know how much work you guys did in that, and how much you helped us in that process. What can we as a committee do? Where can we make progress here? How can we?
We would love it if you agreed everything we recommend. We would say that would be real progress.
There were some fairly concrete recommendations there. If the blockage remains over a Single Equality Act, the two options are there again and I mean, at some stage there may be, if the institutions continue to be blocked and dysfunctional, the two governments may well reach the stage where they trigger the provisions that are already within the Good Friday Agreement. They're not outside the terms of it, to review how things operate. And obviously part of that discussion has to be the long overdue Bill of Rights. And that being implemented. It was the core safeguard under the agreement, and things really aren't working without it. The other recommendation we have is to look at Protocol 12 of the ECHR. This is just one of the protocols that the UK hasn't signed up to. Certainly Labour, when they were last in government, were looking at that. They may well do, given their strong commitment to the ECHR, they may do again. It would have to be the state party who signed up to that. It couldn't be the devolved institutions. But certainly this committee could recommend that, because what that would do was it would bring in a freestanding right to non-discrimination across protected characteristics within law, which would make it much more difficult not to have domestic legislation that codified and implemented that. So that would be a way of bringing on single equality legislation. In terms of the equality duty, certainly we would welcome looking at the issue of the effectiveness of enforcement powers, because we have a piece of legislation there in Section 75 that's supposed to work. And if it's not working, recommendations about that would be very helpful. They may be directed at the Commission in terms of it making greater use of its enforcement powers, at limiting delays. Now, they did, after we took a complaint to the Public Service Ombudsman, they did have to revise their procedures and put some timescales in. But again, all of that could be tightened. In terms of the good relations duty, certainly we'd welcome pushing forward on the issue of a definition, and that could be built into quality schemes, but also the recommendation to remove the good relations impact assessment question, which is not compatible with the legislation, was not required by the legislation, and has essentially frustrated the purpose of the equality duty. That doesn't require legislative change, but it would require a change in the Commission's guidance, which would be relatively easy to do.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Carol, we'll try again. Go ahead, please. No, sorry.
Not happening.
Exit and rejoin.
We're just wondering, could you exit and rejoin, Carol? Please, thank you. I just, I had a question I didn't get to. Maybe you have touched about it just while we'll get Carol back on. And that was really about what difference do you think it would mean if there was the definition on the face of a Northern Ireland bill for good relations? What difference would you really, what would the tangible, what would the manifestation of that be?
It would narrow the space for mischievous lay interpretations of good relations as just being about what annoys a particular party or whether it's political opposition to a policy, because it would put a definition on the face of the legislation, and that hopefully would prevent it from being misused. It would also set much more of a framework for how the good relations duty could be used positively, how you could have a framework for positive action around all of those things, around duties to tackle prejudice and promote understanding. I mean, given, and it's remiss not to mention all the far-right violence, of course, that's occurred over this summer, that would be a duty on relevant public authorities, quite clearly the good relations duty, so far as it relates to racism, to tackle racist information, for example. So we're into the realm of, and promoting integration as well, we're into the realm of compelling public authorities within their functions to take positive action, rather than this duty either doing nothing. And I appreciate there's good relations work that doesn't relate to the Section 75 duties as such in terms of programmes of local government and things like that, but it would also put a bit of a structure on that as to what those programmes should be targeted at and aimed to do.
And that, for example, is something that over the last few weeks the trade union movement, employers' organisations have been taking extremely seriously, prepared to put resources into what you would call a proper definition of good relations, understanding how you might tackle the issue of racism, for example. And we would want to see that matched by the public sector, by the public authorities, by the system. That would give exactly the right signal.
Okay, thank you. Carol, do you want to try again? Thank you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, great. Go ahead, Carol.
So sorry about that. I just want to thank you for your paper. I thought it was very, very informative. And just to say that the denial of equality and the denial of rights has been very political. So the fact that you're pointing that out, you're just pointing out the obvious. But Daniel and Patricia, I don't know if you were in for the Equality Commission's presentation to the committee, and I did ask about the good relations versus equality stuff. So I suppose the question that I'm asking you is, where did this good relations impact assessment come from? And, is it not in breach of Section 75 that's used instead of implementing Section 75 as a duty?
So where it came from was 2010 guidance that was issued by the Commission that would relate also to its model equality scheme, whereby they introduced a recommendation that public authorities, in addition to doing equality screening, also did so-called good relations impact assessments. We agree that that doing these on the concept of good relations is not really amenable to an impact assessment in the same way the concept of equality is. The concept of equality is incredibly well defined in case law. There's been equality laws for decades, so that when you're trying to work out what a discriminatory detriment is, there's a huge body of sort of jurisprudence and case law and standards as to what that actually means. Whereas if you're just going on a lay definition of good relations, then none of that exists. It becomes subjective, and we do think that that has frustrated the purpose of the equality duty. It also contradicts other guidance. It's very good that the Equality Commission had issued on equality impact assessments. If you take their very lengthy guidance of hundreds of pages that I think dates back to 2005, more or less, or sometime around then, you can word search the word good relations and you'll find that it doesn't appear at all other than in the text of the legislation, and that's because equality impact assessments were about the equality duty. The good relations duty was supposed to be about complementary actions. Now, we were worried back in 1998, before my time at CAJ. Patricia, I think you were.
I was around.
You were around, but we were worried back in 1998, and as a response to that this would happen, we foresaw this happening. And as a response to that, Mo Mowlam at the time, the Secretary of State, agreed to amend the legislation to build in this safeguard that subordinated the good relations duty to the equality duty, that it must be without prejudice, etc. But that, unfortunately, has proved insufficient. And it's proved insufficient, and we think certainly the Commission's recommendation to do good relations impact assessments, rather than focus on the positive duties that a good relations duty could foresee, have created this problem. We've also repeatedly asked the Commission, who stand by this sort of recommendation, to give us a single example of when this good relations impact assessment methodology has produced some sort of positive result that they can point to justify its continued existence. And no single example has ever been forthcoming.
Yeah, and I mean, Chair, that's my concern. I mean, I see people using good relations as a way of not implementing equality, and that's been a custom and practice for political arguments, but also my own experiences. I've seen it in some local governments, and I've actually seen it in some departments. So, in relation to this inquiry, and because I believe it is an equality gap, as well as the obvious around the Bill of Rights and the Single Equality Bill, for me, it's a real equality gap, and it needs to be fixed because it's about the here and now. So, I suppose we would need to go back to the Equality Commission and also perhaps even look at putting a better or greater definition on what good relations should be in parallel to what equality impact assessments are.
Well, if we don't, we continue with, for example, a divided city with 70 separation walls and the same divided mindsets that we had, decades ago. We should be in a different place by now, and that was always our concern, that there would be, some redefinition of what we were seeking to do with the whole equality and human rights agenda. It is about creating a better society, and we need to make our minds up. I mean, do we still envisage living in a divided city, separated by 70 or more walls in another quarter of a century? Certainly on the coalition, we're adamant, and all the 100+ member organisations are adamant that we will do our bit to create a better society here. We would like to see the political system getting on board with this.
Yeah, so would we, Patricia, and like yourself and others. I'm just relentlessly optimistic, because if you don't be that way, but the issue for me is if older people or disabled people or LGBTQ+ are being discriminated against, they're not being discriminated against because they're Catholic LGBT or they're Protestant LGBT. It's just because they're LGBT, and that's the fact. And so for this inquiry, I suppose we would like to see examples of where things can be strengthened under our own remit and hard gaps can be filled that are there. They're not imagined, they're there, they're fact. So again, thank you for your presentation and for your determination and grit for the last 25+ years. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, can I actually just make a point about your initial question? You asked about sort of the difficulties of public authorities in complying with Section 75. And I just wanted to say I do have a degree of sympathy for public authorities around this. I don't think that Section 75 screening and equality impact assessment is prioritized or well-resourced, particularly at a senior level. But, as Daniel has said, this is because ultimately the risk of enforcement for non-compliance is so low. And not only our membership, but increasingly public authorities are saying that while advice and guidance from the Equality Commission is welcome, it doesn't reach senior levels, and enforcement is needed to shift the culture of non-compliance. And actually, what happens is that over time, if done well, screening processes become easier because monitoring is embedded within equality schemes, and once you effectively monitor, you get better data, which leads to better assessments. And then just finally, I just wanted to make the point that just because something is difficult doesn't mean that it's a reasonable defense to failing to comply with a legal obligation.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paula, just to come back on that, there are very senior chief executives and senior managers within local authorities and within some of the arm's length bodies. It's not that, because I frankly have no sympathy for them at all, okay? They're very well paid. They need to be at least across what their statutory duties are, and if they're not, then boo-hoo. Because as citizens and as residents and as ratepayers, people are getting shafted, and for me that's just not good enough. So appreciate what you're saying, you're very generous, but I just can't let that go unchallenged.
Okay. I think just to clarify, I do agree with you. I think a lot of equality officers do have really well intentions, especially at a council level. They're just often not in the rooms when decisions are being made.
Okay, we're just about to lose another member there. Thank you, Timothy. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, panel, for coming today, and again for your submission. You can see the determination in the room and the committee. I hope to get some tangible outputs at the far end of this. So we'll keep in touch with you as we continue with this inquiry. Okay, members,
thank you very much, Chair. Committee.
Yeah, we need 5, do we?
Yes, fine for division. Yes.
Oh, it's Carol's online, sorry, of course. Okay, so we'll keep pursuing quite quickly here in case we fall out of quorum. Okay, members, I'm going to move on very quickly to agenda item 8, which is the SL1 and Fair Employment Monitoring Amendment Regulations. So you'll find the clerk's brief on this on page 102 of your pack. 104 of the pack is the SL1 letter and draft explanatory memorandum, and page 112 of the pack is the draft statutory rule. So, members, the Executive Office is proposing to make the statutory rule subject to the draft affirmative resolution procedure to amend the Fair Employment Monitoring Regulations Northern Ireland 1999 to provide monitoring information in respect of school teachers from 12th of May 2024 only, the date on which the school teachers exemption was removed by the commencement of sections 1 and 2 of the Fair Employment School Teachers Act Northern Ireland 2022. So I'm just seeking your views on this proposed change, and if you're content to proceed, or whether we need any additional information or clarification from the department. Any thoughts? Oh no, okay. I just have one question really for the department, and that is how the Equality Commission, given the pressures it's under around its full range of statutory duties and responsibilities, how they are being funded, resourced to take on this additional work. So if you're content, we will write to the department and ask them what additional compensation. Okay, so moving on, so that we're content with the proposal for the change of the statutory rule. So agenda item 9, we've got the SL1 period products, Executive Office Specified Public Service Bodies Regulations, Northern Ireland 2024. You'll find the clerk's brief on page 116 of the pack, and on page 118 of the pack you'll find the SL1 letter, draft statutory rule and draft explanatory memorandum. So the Executive Office is proposing to make a statutory rule subject to the draft affirmative resolution procedure, to make a statutory rule to specify by regulations those public service bodies to which the duty to make free period products available for users while on their premise applies. So you'll find it's in your pack, that actual list. So where am I? I had highlighted this. Am I in the wrong one? Sorry. So I'm just going to go through. So we've got, in terms of the arm's length bodies, we've got the Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Childhood Abuse, the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors, the Equality Commission, the Historical Institutional Abuse Redress Board, the Maze Law and Cash Development Corporation, Northern Ireland Judicial Appointments Commission, Strategic Investment Board and the Victims Payment Board. So are members content that those are the list that are included? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Okay, members, we have got are we content with that? That was fine. Okay, so we've got at agenda item 10, the Mother and Baby Institutions Review of Committee Response, and you'll find that the clerk's brief on page 127, and on page 129 you'll find the committee's draft response to the consultation. I'm just wondering if people had an opportunity to go through that. There was quite a lot in our packs today. Yeah. Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, Paula, I did go through it, but I think it needs to be like a separate.
Yes.
I do, honestly, because even just the whole consultative, the Victims and Survivors Consultative Forum, and even just some of the issues that were raised, I just think we need to put it as a standalone item on our agenda. And today was appreciate the first day back, and we're trying to kind of catch up, but I think it just deserves more time.
I said that to the clerk earlier today. I thought so too, because we'd given a commitment to the last witness panel that we would bring them back again. We would engage with them around this. So I think that we owe them that duty. So we have that paper. Thank you to the clerk and his team for pulling it together. So we will get that into the forward work programme. So there'll be a wee bit of work on that, but sooner rather than later. Okay. So are people content that we reprioritise this? So in terms of 11, we've got the draft forward work programme, and you'll find that on page 134 of your meeting pack. So what we're also going to try and fit in, members, is a briefing from the committee on the strategic framework for the ending violence against women and girls. Again, rejig a bit, so we'll need to get a time from the DALO on that, so we'll move on that. Again, members, on section 12 in terms of correspondence, there was a lot to go through today. If anybody wants to raise anything now, but I'm happy for any issues to be picked up next week in case anybody feels that they've missed it or it's a bit rushed today. Anything people want to raise today? No. Okay, just a couple of issues then. On page 1001 of the pack, there's a letter from the Independent Monitoring Authority for Citizens' Rights Agreements requesting to meet the committee to discuss matters relating to the EU and EEA/EFTA citizens who have chosen to remain in Northern Ireland following UK's exit from the European Union. Is that for us? Is that for our committee, or should that be the Windsor Framework?
No, it wouldn't be the Windsor Framework.
No.
They have a very specific statutory remit, so it does fall with us at the moment.
Okay.
I'm getting it either way. So.
Okay. Okay. What do we think? I suppose my point is, I think we've got such a tight agenda in terms of our forward work programme. Would you be content that I met with them, with the clerk and the deputy chair, and we would bring a report back with that? And then if once you see the report, if you think that it's worth a committee session, then we can pick that up. Okay. So the next issue is the IMACRA invite to the committee at future date. What is that relate to?
Sorry, that's the same thing.
Oh, is that it? Okay. Yes. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Goodness, all these acronyms. Okay. There's also a letter in the committee pack there, just for your attention there. The Commissioner Designate for Victims of Crime is calling for a rapid review of the recent racially motivated hate crimes. You'll find that there. Members, we are meeting with the Commissioner Designate, the Chair, Deputy Chair and the Clerk on the 25th, but just to draw your attention to next week, we will have the victims of the race hate crime over the summer. They'll be here next week, so that'll sort of help inform that. Okay, I'm going to move on there. There's plenty in your correspondence. Anybody want to raise anything, or are you happy to maybe bring it up? No. Okay, members, any other business? Okay, thank you, members. It was quite a heavy session for our first week back, but appreciate your patience. Our next meeting is next week at 2:00 in this room. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound.